At approximately 4:30 p.m., the boat carrying Nolan Wells reportedly departed Horn Island. Yet later witness accounts placed Nolan somewhere on that same island. And then came another detail that made the timeline even harder to explain. His phone returned with the boat, while questions remained about Nolan himself. Now, Warren Hudson's account, GPS records, witness statements, and an autopsy that has not resolved the cause of death are being examined side by side. Each piece adds another layer to the same unanswered problem. Because somewhere between the boat leaving Horn Island and arriving back, the known timeline appears to fracture. So where exactly does Nolan Wells' timeline stop making sense?
The evidence, where is the video of the boat? Is that Nolan right there? Walking along the light blue shorts, and he at that time had on a white shirt. I think that's Nolan right there. Dave Mack, where is the evidence, the video evidence of them coming back?
Nolan Wells was only 18 when he traveled to Horn Island on July 4th. He had gone there expecting a holiday. Instead, his family would soon be facing a question that had no simple answer. How could an 18-year-old vanish from a relatively small island while the people who arrived with him eventually made the journey back without him? In the beginning, the account seemed uncomplicated. Then investigators had the GPS timeline to consider. Then came witness accounts. Then there was Nolan's phone. And eventually, attention turned toward Warren Hudson and the others who were reportedly with Nolan that day. The central issue is not which theory people have chosen to believe. It is whether the available evidence can actually support the version of events investigators were given. Because if Nolan remained on Horn Island after the boat departed, then those minutes, and everything that may have happened during them, take on an entirely different significance. Before the headlines, before the speculation, before the competing explanations, there was only Nolan. An 18-year-old, spending Independence Day at Horn Island. The trip had begun without any obvious indication that something was wrong. According to the timeline presented in public reporting, the boat left its original dock at roughly 9:56 that morning and reached Horn Island at approximately 11:14. For several hours, the island appeared to be nothing more than the location of an ordinary holiday outing. But as the afternoon progressed, that picture began to change. Eventually, the boat was preparing to leave. And according to the timeline discussed by Nancy Grace and her guests, the Triton departed Horn Island at around 4:30 p.m. That moment matters because it creates a critical dividing line in the investigation. If Nolan was aboard when the boat left, investigators would need to establish what happened to him afterward. But if he was still somewhere on the island, another question immediately follows: what happened after the boat pulled away? That distinction may determine where the known timeline ends, and where the unanswered part of Nolan Wells' story begins.
Witnesses reach out to us, two confirmed witnesses that saw Nolan Wells on the island around 6 p.m. on July 4th. Well after the Triton, as you said, left around 4:30. And so those witnesses have went to investigators, they've talked to the police, and they've done what they're supposed to do. These witnesses know Nolan. They've known him for a long time. They were able to make a positive ID.
Fox reportedly represents acquaintances who were aboard the Triton with Nolan, and his account introduces a detail that investigators cannot simply set aside. According to the reported account, two witnesses told investigators they saw Nolan on Horn Island later that afternoon. One alleged sighting was placed at roughly 5 p.m., another was reportedly around 6. If those observations are accurate, then the Triton leaving Horn Island at approximately 4:30 would not mark the end of Nolan's known timeline. It could mark the beginning of its most difficult and consequential gap. Picture the afternoon as a clock. The boat departs at around 4:30. A reported sighting places Nolan on the island near 5. Another allegedly puts him there around 6. Those timestamps create something far more significant than a simple difference between eyewitness accounts. They potentially open a window of roughly 90 minutes, one that could become critical if the sightings are eventually corroborated. But eyewitness testimony cannot answer that question by itself. Each account has to be tested against whatever independent evidence exists. GPS records could help establish where the boat was at specific moments. Video footage could potentially determine when and where someone appeared. Phone records may provide another timeline through digital activity. And statements from additional witnesses could either reinforce those accounts or introduce contradictions. That is what makes the reported sightings important. Not because they automatically prove Nolan remained on Horn Island, but because if they can be independently supported, they could force investigators to examine a period of the case that remains deeply unresolved.
Understand that there's video and witnesses. One places him there at 5, one places him there at 6. significance. The Triton, and we can show this by GPS, they are right about this, left Horn Island around 4:30. So if he is spotted, and you can confirm to me that he is spotted there at 5 or 6, if that video has a timestamp on it, and I can corroborate that, or I can corroborate the witnesses weren't drunk. Hey,
the issue is no longer simply whether someone claimed to have seen Nolan. The more important question is whether investigators can independently establish that Nolan was actually on Horn Island after the Triton had already departed. If that can be confirmed, the entire sequence of events becomes far more complicated. If it cannot, investigators still have to determine how those reported sightings fit into the case, and whether they can be reconciled with the physical and digital evidence. Either way, the clock remains at the center of the mystery. There is another complication. Public accounts have described witnesses who reportedly knew Nolan and felt confident that the person they saw was him. That could carry significant weight. But certainty does not necessarily guarantee accuracy. Investigators would need to examine the circumstances behind each identification. How far away was the witness? Exactly what did they see? How long did they have the person in view? Was the face clearly visible? What were the lighting conditions? Was anything blocking their line of sight? And perhaps most importantly, can the identification be supported by evidence that does not depend on memory alone? One piece of video discussed in the first transcript appears to show a person bending over, but the available visual information is limited. That footage could raise a possibility worth investigating. But there is a critical distinction between seeing something that resembles Nolan and actually establishing that the person in the footage was Nolan. A possibility can open an investigative lead. It cannot, by itself, close the case.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there's no details about any identification. It's just a broad statement that other people saw Nolan after the boat left. The video you just showed shows from a view from behind of someone bending over. Did the person have sunglasses on? Were they familiar with who they were actually looking at and identifying? You know, how much had they drank during the day? It was a party scene. That's what usually these boat spots are. There's one by me in West Palm Beach, very similar setup called Peanut Island. So most people also, right, they don't think something's important until after the fact. They're just going about their day, notice people walking by. So from what you showed, that's not a very strong identification from that position. But there's no...
That distinction could determine how the entire case is understood. If the reported sightings withstand scrutiny, then the Triton's departure may not represent the end of Nolan's timeline. It could represent the moment the most important questions begin. But if those sightings cannot be independently supported, investigators may have to reconstruct Nolan's final movements from a very different starting point. And within that reconstruction, one name repeatedly enters the discussion: Warren Hudson. Warren Hudson has become closely associated with public accounts of Nolan's final known hours. But this is precisely where the evidence has to be separated from assumption. Warren has not been established as Nolan's killer, and the information presented here does not establish that he caused Nolan's death. The more precise question is whether the account attributed to Warren is consistent with the available evidence. According to the version discussed publicly, Warren and the others maintained that Nolan had remained behind on Horn Island. If that account is accurate, it would mean Nolan became separated from the group before the Triton made its return journey. That could potentially explain why Nolan was no longer aboard when the boat eventually reached the mainland. I had no enter into that accuracy. It was ever so identical. But then another detail enters the timeline, one that is difficult to overlook. If Nolan stayed behind, what happened to the phone associated with him? According to material discussed in the second transcript, the phone reportedly left Horn Island aboard the boat, and that creates a new problem for the timeline. Because if Nolan and his phone were no longer together, the device may tell investigators something very different from the whereabouts of the person who carried it. Right?
Well, that's 100% right. You know, the police have to keep an open mind here. It's not even a criminal investigation. So 6 weeks approximately has gone by. The folks that were on the boat with Nolan, nothing has come out even remotely to indicate they were involved in some foul play at this point at all. They're just people that went out to this island with their friend. It appears their friend may have stayed afterwards, and, you know, maybe a tragedy happened. Maybe something else happened that wasn't involving them.
That detail creates a difficult evidence problem. According to the reported accounts, Nolan was left behind, but the phone associated with him was not. Those two facts now have to be explained within the same timeline. There are several possibilities. Nolan could have accidentally left the device behind. Someone else could have picked it up. Or the phone could simply have been carried away without anyone realizing how important it might later become. At this stage, those possibilities remain possibilities. Determining which one fits the evidence requires something much more precise than speculation: the forensic record. The phone matters because it could preserve a digital trail of that day. According to the second transcript, the device reportedly traveled away from Horn Island aboard the boat, reached the mainland, passed through additional locations, and eventually made its way back toward Nolan's family. What each movement actually means would have to be established through investigation. But the chain of custody raises questions of its own. Where was the phone at each point? Who had possession of it? Was the device powered on? Was someone accessing it? Were applications opened? Were messages sent or received? Were photographs created? Did the phone retain usable location information? And perhaps the most consequential question of all, was anything erased? Those answers cannot be determined simply by holding the device or examining its exterior. They require a proper forensic examination. And according to the accounts presented in the transcripts, that examination became the subject of a dispute involving Nolan's family and the district attorney's office. The first transcript states that Nolan's family had indicated they were willing to make the phone available, but they wanted an independent expert involved while the examination took place. That distinction matters. The issue, as described in the transcript, was not simply that the family refused to surrender the device. Their stated position was that the phone could be examined, but under conditions that included independent oversight. A July 15th meeting was reportedly held in which that approach was discussed. Then, according to the family's account, they were later asked to turn the phone over within a limited time frame while they were outside the state. That sequence could create the impression that the family was refusing to cooperate, but their stated explanation was different. They maintained that they were willing to provide the device. The disagreement was over how, when, and under whose supervision the examination would take place. And that distinction left another question hanging over the investigation. What exactly could the phone reveal if it were subjected to a complete forensic examination?
Over the phone, but we want someone in the middle here, someone from the outside, an expert to analyze the phone. It appeared everyone agreed. Then all of a sudden they get a letter saying, we want the phone and you have 24 hours to send it over. The DA sent that. And the parents were out of town and said, wait, we don't have the time to do that. Hence the narrative that they're not cooperating. Now they say, Nolan's parents, look, we have our experts on standby this week, pick a day. And not to mention, on the 19th would have been Nolan's 19th birthday, a difficult week for the family, but they say, hey, we'll give up his cell phone. We want someone, a mediator, if you will, an expert in the middle.
Well, this is interesting, what you just said.
This is the point where Nolan's phone becomes more than personal property. It becomes a potential piece of evidence. And if that evidence could eventually become relevant to a grand jury investigation, preserving its integrity becomes critical for everyone involved. Which raises the next question. What could a proper forensic examination actually uncover? Digital forensics is very different from simply opening a phone and scrolling through its contents. Investigators can, depending on the device and circumstances, create a forensic image or other validated copy of the available data and conduct their analysis from that preserved material. The examination may include communications, photographs, application records, timestamps, location-related information, and other digital artifacts stored by the device or its applications. In some circumstances, material that a user believes has been deleted may leave behind recoverable traces, provided those traces have not been overwritten or otherwise made inaccessible. But that does not mean every deleted message, photograph, or file can automatically be recovered. Digital evidence is rarely that simple. What matters is what the device actually preserved, what can be technically extracted, and whether the resulting data can be authenticated and placed accurately within the timeline. Because a phone can contain information that is invisible during ordinary use. And if Nolan's device preserved even a small piece of that afternoon, it could potentially help investigators determine not only where the phone went, but whether its digital trail can help explain what happened to Nolan.
A device like the Cellbrite, which is one of the main producers of this type of software that can download phones. First of all, obviously you have to have the password to the phone. If not, then you have to go through a lot of processes to get past the password and into the phone. But once you're into the phone, and this can be done with other people standing by, as you were talking about, another investigator for the defense or for the family or something like that being there, they can sit there and watch you download the phone. And basically, once you download a copy of what's on the phone, and you're not really messing with the evidence that's on the phone, you're not changing it, you're just copying it to another computer, and then you can start going through that data. You can look at all the text messages, and
That is what could make Nolan's phone so significant. Its value may not depend on discovering a single dramatic message or one piece of information that suddenly explains everything. Digital evidence can be powerful because it helps reconstruct sequences, A timestamp attached to a message could potentially establish when an interaction occurred. A photograph could provide evidence of an activity or location. An application record might show that the device was being used at a particular moment. A location-related artifact could either support a witness account or raise questions about it. Even deleted communications may, in some circumstances, leave behind traces indicating that data once existed on the device. None of those possibilities automatically proves what happened. But together, if properly recovered, authenticated, and placed in context, they could help build a more precise timeline of Nolan's final hours. And that is why the phone matters. The question is not simply what investigators might find on it. It is whether the device contains enough reliable digital evidence to confirm or challenge the human accounts surrounding Nolan's disappearance.
Down the location, don't let anybody on there. Get the dogs in, see what type of reaction they have. Every second that goes by, every minute that goes by, every hour that goes by will have an impact on the dog work when it comes to age of the material, age of the odor, and more importantly, what your contamination factor is. And this is the one big thing that nobody ever really thinks about. That they think the dogs are going to be these magical creatures that detect everything that you're looking for. But that's going to be mitigated dramatically by any type of human activity on the scene. That's the first thing that has to happen. So if you're going to use dogs, you need to get them out there right away. They actually have to be one of the first things on scene.
The longer a scene remains uncontrolled, the more difficult it can become to determine what happened there. That is why the early handling of Horn Island, the Triton, and every piece of physical evidence matters so much. But among all the unresolved evidence, one of the most important pieces may still be the device connected to Nolan. The case now rests on a timeline that has never been completely resolved. GPS data can establish the boat's movements. Witness accounts may either support or challenge the possibility that Nolan remained on Horn Island after the Triton departed. Warren Hudson's reported account offers one explanation for why Nolan was allegedly left behind. And Nolan's phone could contain digital information capable of testing that explanation against a separate record of events. Meanwhile, the independent autopsy reportedly left both the cause and manner of death undetermined. The state autopsy remains unavailable to the public as the case moves through the grand jury process. But none of these pieces should be treated as a verdict. They are evidence, and evidence still being evaluated. That distinction is especially important when discussing Warren Hudson. He should remain an investigative focus, not a declared culprit. If his reported account is consistent with the GPS records, witness statements, and digital evidence, that consistency matters. If important elements of those records contradict his account, that matters as well. And the same standard has to apply to every person connected to Nolan's final known hours. The objective is not to force one individual into a predetermined theory. It is to determine which version of events can withstand the full body of evidence. And after everything that has been raised, one question still sits at the center of the investigation. What happened between the moment the boat left Horn Island and the moment Nolan died? Witness testimony could narrow that window. GPS data could narrow it further. Additional medical evidence could eventually clarify how Nolan died. But if Nolan's phone contains the missing digital trail, messages, timestamps, photographs, location information, or other traces of activity, it could provide something theories cannot: a sequence, a record, a way to place events back into order. And if that digital timeline eventually conflicts with the version of events investigators have been examining, the investigation could take a very different direction, because the question is not simply whether Warren Hudson was involved. The question is whether the evidence ultimately points toward him or somewhere else entirely. And if Nolan's phone can reveal where the timeline actually breaks, what happens when that sequence becomes impossible to dismiss? If you want to follow the Nolan Wells investigation through evidence rather than speculation, subscribe and stay with the case as new developments emerge. Share this video with others following Nolan's story. And if you have credible information about what happened on Horn Island, provide it to the appropriate investigators.